Before you click away thinking that this video title is clickbait, I would like to say right up front that personally, I really loved Bridgerton season 4. I thought that the romance was amazing and well developed, and I found myself invested in the subplots because it gave characters that were getting stuck in the rut of their storyline new life and a new direction, which I really appreciate. However, there is one thing that the other seasons did better in my book, however, that season 4 felt just a bit short of, and that is the presence of the flawed Bridgerton love interest. We got it with Simon Bassett in season 1, with Kathani Sharma in season 2, with Penelope Featherington in season 3. We did not get that, however, with Sophie Bake in season 4, and I do think that that added a personal loss of character conflict born as a result of that flaw, which then reflected in how season 4 panned out. And if you're curious about how Kate and Penn were portrayed as flawed while Sophie wasn't, the significance of that absence, and what instead the season wrote in as the point of conflict to serve as a substitute for Sophie's non existent flaws as far as the season was concerned, well, then keep watching. Now, before I start talking about Bridgerton season 4's lack of a flawed love interest, I would like to turn my mind to some gratitude first, namely by saying a big thank you to my lovely patrons and YouTube members whose support have been instrumental in helping me continue to make content, especially since I started doing this full time at the start of last year, which was the last time I was in paid employment. And a special shout out to Lena, Sherry, Holly, and Kat for their extra support. You get all the hearts and kisses to mwah. If you too would like to support me on Patreon or become a YouTube member to enjoy certain perks, even get a shout out, the link to do so is in the description bar. Now, with that said, over to the flawed Bridgerton love interest, starting with Simon Bassett in season 1, whose clear character flaw, which served the plot, was his willingness to go to any length to ensure that he is able to fulfill the vow he made at his father's deathbed about ensuring that the Bassett line dies with him, even when it meant that it would keep him away from the love he so sorely desires with Daphne. Now, I am certain I will probably have people watching wondering why exactly it matters that we got Simon in season 1 be so adverse to the thought of fathering a child due to the abuse he had suffered at the hands of his father and the role that played in elevating the story for the season. Well, it's because that desire or lack of it thereof was crucial to his romance with Daphne. The conflict that arose as a result of that particular choice of Simon not openly communicating that with Daphne or informing her of the vow he had made, the fact that he framed it intentionally in a way in which she would misconstrue his words as the choice having been taken away from him due to a medical impairment meant that it was set up right from the very beginning that this conflict, when it reaches its peak, i.e., when Daphne discovers the truth, is going to blow up spectacularly in his face in a way that Daphne would feel betrayed, which we, of course, know led to the sexual assault sequence that was just gross. But ultimately, what it then meant was that it put both Daphne and Simon at odds for the second stretch of the season up until they get their resolution at the end, which saw them reconcile based off of Daphne finally getting to be a witness in a way to Simon's father's disregard for his son and the abuse that occurred as a result of the late Duke considering his stammer a flaw, unworthy of his heir. And so Daphne, who finally understands why Simon is so against becoming a father, is able to speak to the root of that hurt. And that then serves as the resolution that leads to she and Simon both getting their happy ending. Simon's flaws as Daphne, Bridgerton's love interest, is also inherently tied to what then drives Daphne's own characterization, her desire to be the very embodiment of the perfection that is expected of her by virtue of her status as the oldest of the Bridgerton girls. Daphne is driven by her need to be the perfect daughter, the perfect wife, and ultimately the perfect mother. And so, therefore, Simon's refusal to be a father is in direct conflict and stands against everything that Daphne wants and desires, which in turn is what then drives her odious actions when she interprets Simon's withheld truth as a lie. I will, of course, like to state categorically at this point that this isn't me attempting to imply that the Bridgerton siblings themselves are without flaws. Matter of fact, their flaws usually are in sync with their love interest flaws, which is what then adds to the basic conflict of their individual season, i.e., Daphne's obsession with being perceived as a perfect wife and mother, in turn meant that Simon's insistence on keeping his vows to his father, which led to him technically lying to her, meant that Daphne read that as a failure on her part. After all, it is then meant that her husband wasn't incapable of siring a child, he's just choosing not to. And so she would have ultimately failed in her duty to give him an heir since he's actively choosing not to have one with her. It doesn't justify her latter actions, but it does put them in a much clearer light. And then there's Kanthony. Now, I know, before anyone says anything, I would like to stress that I honestly do believe that Kathani Sharma is perfect in every single way. Yes, I am biased, but I worship at her feet, and yet at the same time, I am aware that perfect though I might find her to be, it doesn't mean that she is without flaws. Yes, she's stubborn and does have a one track mind, which in turn meant that her initial judgment and assessment of Anthony is one that she runs with without stopping to reconsider or question certain discoveries, even as she finds herself falling for him and slowly realizing that he's more than what he had initially presented himself as. However, I do think her biggest flaw, which ties directly into her romance with Anthony, is that Kate Sharma is a character who is driven by duty, a duty that would see her sacrifice her own happiness in order to ensure the happiness of her family, even if getting to that point meant stripping them of their agency. And before anyone is quick to reply that, well, being selfless can't be a flaw, it's a good trait. I would like to point out that, narratively speaking, Kate's insistence on placing duty over her desires meant that she operated under the misassumption that her happiness doesn't matter. All that matters is Edwina. That in itself speaks to her clearly believing that she's undeserving of the great things that Edwina should have. And while society likes to paint that self sacrifice as being a beautiful thing, especially when it's being done by an older sibling, psychologically, we know it takes a toll on both the older sibling who is being taught all their lives to sacrifice for their younger ones, and it also has a toll on the younger siblings who have to bear the guilt of everything that was given up for them. That isn't fair to either Kate nor Edwina. And matter of fact, it does infantilize Edwina within the narrative, hence why she is so upset. However, like I stated earlier, the flaws of the Bridgerton love interest are meant to bear a connection to whichever Bridgerton sibling they are meant to be with. And in the case for Kate, that is Anthony. Now, the interesting bit about Kate and Anthony's relationship is that their flaws are so aligned and so in sync because they are both older siblings who bear the responsibility of caring for their families whilst taking that care to the extremes, whereby they really do not leave much room for their siblings to be able to make their own choices and decisions as adults. We are, of course, excluding Gregory and Hyacinth from this conversation since they are technically still kids at this point. But as I was saying, Kate's flaw is that she's utterly driven by her sense of duty, which drives her self sacrificial tendencies. Anthony, on the other hand, is also driven by a sense of duty and responsibility. And it is this flaw that they both share, which adds conflict to their relationship, whereby Anthony's duty of being the Viscount Bridgerton means that he feels obligated to pick absolutely the best possible bride that is most suitable for the title. Kind of like how Daphne felt like the onus slash responsibility was on her to make the perfect match so that it can benefit her sisters. Anthony, on the other hand, believes that the onus is on him to make the perfect choice for the Viscountess Bridgerton for the sake of the line and of the family, and that to do so is wants or desires or even love is irrelevant in the face of him being able to fulfill his duty. And so when he considers what he believes is expected of him, Edwina, who was declared as the season's diamond and thus the one handpicked by the queen to be the very absolute best that the season has to offer with regards a potential partner for the willing unmarried lords in search of a bride, fulfills the requirements that duty demands of Anthony, which in turn meant that her sister, who Anthony finds himself attracted to, who isn't the season's diamond. And so duty would demand that he cannot choose her, is the point of conflict for him. He spends the entire season worrying about what he wants versus what is expected of him, which is why the conversation with Daphne on what should have been his wedding day to Edwina matters, where she basically points out that he has been living all his life for the family and not for himself, even though that wasn't a demand that they had placed on him. Now, we all know that circumstances as they played out didn't need his siblings or his mother to openly state what was expected of him. With the death of Edmund, Anthony had to automatically step into those shoes, whether or not he was prepared for them. And so, with him having to take on such a role when he was quite young and had his otherwise healthy father in front of him, a father who had decades in front of him in one moment and was dead the next, and a mother who shut down after his father's passing, leaving Anthony to suddenly have to juggle the estate, the responsibility of being a viscount, whilst also somewhat caring for his siblings. Anthony Bridgerton really didn't have the typical teenage experience. The same we can say applies to Kate, who had to deal with Mary also shutting down after Kate's father died, and she had to manage the estate and their finances whilst caring for her baby sister. I do think that it was made quite clear that for Kate and Anthony, they had gotten so used to sacrificing their joy for the common good of the family that when it turned out that the common good was them choosing their joy, their inbuilt flaw of not being able to recognize and accept that automatically created the conflict for their romance. It took them both having to realize that, having their mothers acknowledge that, and their siblings calling them out on that for them to finally be able to have their happy ending. Penelope Featherington's flaw, on the other hand, is tied to her self esteem issues and her desire for power and control. She's the Featherington girl bullied by her siblings and ignored by her mother for being different. She's the wallflower ignored by the ton to the extent that none of them were even able to guess at her secret identity because she's most often overlooked. And that is what drives a lot of her choices and her characterization. The fact that Penelope Featherington isn't really taken seriously, but as Lady Whistledown, she is. It is that desire to have that power and recognition where she gets to have the entirety of the ton dancing to her tune in the palm of her hands. That is the reason for why she's so insistent on maintaining ownership and control over her identity as Lady Whistledown and is unwilling to give it up. Of course, this becomes the source of conflict between her and Colin because Colin's own flaw, which is tied to his search for relevance, something that he lacks by being the second youngest of the Bridgerton boys, the middle child who isn't taken seriously by his older siblings or their mother. Colin, who wants to be respected and seen in society, and so he tries to find that with his writing and with the persona he plays at being when he returns to the ton, clashes with Penelope in that she has everything that he wants: the power, the prestige, the validation. And there's also the fact that whilst the Bridgertons are famous amongst the rest of the Mayfair families, they are also a pretty private family. No family, after all, wants their dirty linens washed in public, nor are they happy with those they are in conflict with having ammunition against them in the identity of information that would otherwise have stayed in the family. And Colin, who is written as being quite protective of his family, he is the Bridgerton boy after all, who offers his mother a listening ear when she's drunk, who is present for his brothers and there for his sisters when they need him to be. To Colin, his family is everything, which is what makes matters even more complicated for him and Pen. Penelope's work as Lady Whistledown has meant that she has sometimes covered secrets as it pertains to the Bridgertons, but most importantly, she had been scathing in her analysis of him, which when he just returned, which to Colin further exacerbated the feelings of inadequacy and his desperation for relevancy that was the driving force behind the transformation he had undergone in the first place. It's yet another reason why I am of the opinion that season 3 wasn't as strong as the other seasons because both Penelope and Colin's flaws are so perfectly aligned to bounce off each other and to exacerbate their conflict that they experience in the latter part of their romance. However, the season doesn't really get enough time to get a deep dive into Colin's flaws and the reason why he's so against Penelope's work as Lady Whistledown until practically at the end of the season that it kind of loses its teeth in the first watch. By rewatches, of course, once we have the confirmation as to the true reason behind his bias, it heightens the stakes a bit further. And no, I am of the opinion that everything that happened with Marina had ideally wrapped up by season two and wasn't really a factor as to why Colin was so upset about Penn being Lady Whistledown. And as we got it confirmed when with Cressida pointing it out, he's able to finally admit to his jealousy being the driving force for why he was so pissed at the revolution of who Penelope's alter ego is. However, no matter how bumpy things were with that regards in season three, it is still better than season four as it pertains to the flawed Bridgerton love interest. Since with Benophie, we can all mostly agree that when you really consider it, of all the love interests we've gotten so far, Sophie is the only one that is practically flawless. Hers is a story of having been taken advantage of by the woman her father married, who in turn forced her into a life of servitude until the one day she decided to do something for herself, which Araminta unwittingly discovered and kicked her out as a result of it, setting things in motion that brought Sophie once again into Benedict's orbit. And I know someone is about to say, well, she didn't really reveal her identity as the lady in silver to Benedict, so doesn't that count as a character flaw? To which I would say no. Her identity as the lady in silver is the source of conflict between her and Benedict, who doesn't know her true identity and spends this season torn between the connection he feels towards the lady in silver and his feelings for Sophie, who he finds himself falling for. However, said identity isn't actually a major character flaw, nor can we say that her choice to keep it a secret is a flaw either. It is more a case of self preservation on our part. It doesn't really have to do with her personality or the active choices that she makes that derives from that. Because ultimately, the trope that does inspire Benophie's romance is clearly Cinderella. And Cinderella, as a fairy tale character, is practically flawless by design. This clearly lends itself to Sophie's characterization by extension. However, because the narrative requires a point of conflict between her and Benedict to be aligned to the formula that has been maintained in the previous season, we turn to the class difference between Sophie's status as a maid and Benedict's status as a rich second son who has been made redundant in his role as a spare with the appearance of his brother Anthony's son and heir as the source of conflict between them. The season focuses on Benedict's choices and the steps he is required to take as a result of him desiring Sophie, but being aware that their class difference means that he cannot marry her as far as polite society is concerned, which in turn will reduce her to the status of his mistress. Something that Sophie, who doesn't want to repeat her mother's mistake, chafes at. And so we get a conflict that still works narratively, but isn't as compelling because we're missing a core part of what has made the other romances in the previous seasons work so far. Sophie Bake is a character without flaws, which in turn takes away from how engaging she would otherwise be, and which in turn affects the tension that should be present in her romance with Benedict. Now, before anyone wants to say that, well, Benedict does have his flaws in the season, which tie to Sophie, especially with him wanting Sophie to be his mistress. Narratively speaking, that really doesn't count as a major character flaw either. Matter of fact, Benedict's request for Sophie to be his mistress is one that is considered pragmatic given the time. He really cannot marry her. As the son of one viscount and a brother to another, a brother to a duchess and to a countess, there really isn't the social cachet for him to even be able to make an honest woman out of Sophie. It just cannot work. It is why the Bridgertons needed Araminta to run with the story that Sophie is a distant cousin returned to London and for Queen Charlotte to give subtle legitimacy to the claim before they could make it official. Neither Benedict nor Sophie was to blame for that. It wasn't as a result of their flaws that they couldn't be together and that their romance was affected as a result. No, the problem for that rested solely on their society and how it drew strict lines across the classes, back in Regency England. Now, I would like to stress that this isn't me saying that season 4 was boring or that it wasn't a good season. I have made a ton of videos talking about my love for season 4 and the themes that were explored. I just wanted to make this video that highlighted what set season 4 apart from the other seasons and the other romances that we got to see develop on screen, and why it was a bit different and in some aspects lacking as a result. But of course, these are all just my thoughts. I would, as always, love to hear yours. Whether or not you agree with me, please share them in the comments. Like this video, however, if you've watched so far and haven't done so yet, but enjoyed anything of what I had to say, share it so others can find my channel as well. Or you can check out my gaming or ASMR channels if they sound like something you might be interested in. I have them both linked in the description bar. I will see you tomorrow with a new video. Until then, do remember, obsessing over the things you love, perfectly valid coping mechanism.